Hi everyone, good evening. I hope you can hear me all right. Yes? Okay, it's wonderful to be here, to be back in Scotland. I've spent a lot of time in Scotland, and Scotland is the place to be, of course, when it comes to menstruation. You might know, or you might not know, that a few years ago Scotland passed quite an iconic law making menstrual product access a right for everyone. And really the years before and after that has spurred so much interesting kind of menstrual discussion here in Edinburgh, but also in Scotland, in Britain, and in the world. And it does still feel like it's a bit of a centre for this kind of discussion. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm talking to you today, yes, about menstruation, but about a specific object in that history, which has not been researched very much and has not showed up in all of these wonderful discussions that are happening in Scotland very much at all, actually, and that is the sanitary bin. I'm going to show you a series of very dull photographs today, and these photographs will illustrate this object, because some of you will be familiar with it, very familiar, and some of you will never have seen it, which is quite interesting. And so the object is this little square bin next to the toilet in the image behind me. Why look at the sanitary bin? And every time I say sanitary, it will be with quotation marks. You'll just have to kind of remember that, and I'll come back to the language involved here. Why study this object? Well, my background is I'm an art historian, and art historians are really interested, obviously, in the visual landscapes of the world, things like advertising, art, things that we see. But we're also interested in things that we don't see, and the symbols and codes that come to stand in for the invisible or the taboo. And menstruation is one of those things, I think, because it's incredibly normal. There's probably people in this room menstruating right now. All the time it happens, every single day. And for a person's life, it can be, many, many weeks of your life, many months of your life, years, right? So this is something that happens all the time. But when was the last time you kind of saw evidence of the thing itself? Menstrual blood is something that we very rarely see. Apart from my own, it's not something that I see a lot, but we know that it happens, right? So from a kind of art historical perspective, the question then becomes, okay, so we have this very normal thing, it happens all the time, we know it happens, but we don't see it, usually. So what are the kind of objects and norms and codes and metaphors that come to stand in for this everyday normal thing? What do we see instead? What are the symbols of menstruation in a society like Scotland, like Norway, where the thing itself, menstrual blood, is still a rare public occurrence? Now, the sanitary bin is one of these kind of objects, so normal and regular and everyday that even scholars of the body, of menstruation, of waste management has not paid a lot of attention to it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share with you a series of kind of questions that I had about this object. I'm going to try to answer some of these questions, but it's early days for my own research into this, and I'd be really open to ideas for further avenues, or if anyone here knows someone I should talk to. It really is early days for the study, the critical study of the sanitary bin. But these are the kind of questions that I had going into this. And yes, it was inspired by my own experience. I was sitting in a loo, I had a tampon that was used, and there was not a bin. And suddenly, the bin became very important. So what should I do? Should I take the bloody object with me outside somewhere? I didn't have a bag. Or should I flush it down the loo? And I did flush it, big secret, but I did. Sometimes you don't have a choice, right? Anyways, I missed, in that moment, I really missed that bin that I'd never appreciated and always thought was ugly and kind of in the way and annoying, but I missed it in that moment. So my questions are, and I'll structure my talk this way: what is a sanitary bin actually? What does it do? Why do we use it? How do we use it? What did people do before this thing was invented? Because it was actually invented. Who came up with the idea? And there's a distinct answer to that. Who did the work of the cleaning associated with this waste management object? What problems does it solve? Why is it everywhere? I mean, I just had a look in the loos here. You use the company Wilsons and Services here at the college. Why? Why does the college pay for this service, right? What problems does this object solve? Have there been any critiques of it? I said that little attention has been paid to it, but there have been some voices kind of questioning the whole kind of ecosystem of the bin. And what about the future for this object? I said at the top, Scotland is the place to be if you study menstruation, any facet of it. So what about the sanitary bin at this time of change? So I'll start with my first question. What is a sanitary bin? It's a funny object, this, because for some of you, you'll be rolling your eyes and be like, I know exactly what it is. For some of you, you won't. Kind of the basics, it is a plastic bin, garbage bin, which you will find in the cubicle of a bathroom, not in the public area where you're washing your hands. So it's a private affair using this object. It's plastic, and it's usually of the type of plastic that could withstand high temperatures, so that if you were to throw a cigarette butt down there, it would not start a fire. And fire hazards are part of this story. It will have bactericide in it, usually, maybe a little bit of perfume. And it has a kind of distinct flap at the top, which has a particular name, which I'll come back to. And really, the flap is the innovation in this bin. What you will do is you will put your used products on the flap, which is opened by a pedal, which you could use your foot, for example. Sometimes, if you're really fancy, there's a motion sensor, so you don't have to touch anything. But these are rare and expensive. And down it goes into the bin without you having to see the contents of the bin. So in that way, it's pretty ingenious. It's a private affair. I'm going to stress that because that's the kind of the second innovation of this object. You do not have to go out where other people are washing their hands, drying their hands, putting on makeup, doing whatever. You can do this in the cubicle. That's normally how this is used. Sometimes there is an additional object, and that is the sanitary bin bags, which I collect. Actually, many menstrual scholars and historians collect these things because they are so interesting. They tell us a lot about the changing culture of menstruation and sanitation. This is one of my favorites from Fibrosan, one of the many defect companies that we're going to talk about today that are no longer with us. But this bag I found only last year, which is just fantastic, a stack of them. It tells you, you could put your used tampon or pad in the bag and then put it in the bin if you want to. But usually there's like flower imagery and words like sanitation, feminine hygiene, for the lady, or sometimes just, again, my favorite, lady, as a kind of just screaming at you, lady. But here it says, and this is a bit of a hint to other questions we'll talk about today, please place in the incinerator or the bin. So today you will all obviously put this stuff in the bin, but what's an incinerator got to do with it all? We'll get back to that. I want to spend a little bit of time on that flap, which is called the modesty flap. And the modesty flap is, as I said, I think we can argue, part of the innovation of this object. It is not a regular bin where you see the content that other people have put in the bin, okay? The modesty flap, by virtue of something you pedal, so no hands, right? The flap comes up, you put your product in, flap goes down. You do not have to see what other people have put in there. And the word modesty obviously speaks to a wider culture of menstruation, which maybe suggests that we need to be modest about this, a little bit squeamish and careful, perhaps. And it's what some scholars call kind of menstrual etiquette, or the menstrual blood concealment imperative, that there is kind of a societal game constantly being played, hiding this kind of blood evidence, even within the safe space of the private cubicle within a bathroom. So the modesty flap, one of the innovations. Okay, so much so for the bin. Maybe you're not super impressed by the modesty flap. Don't worry, there's something else that the bin provides, and that is a cleaning and exchange service. Maybe you've come across sites like this. This is what my last place of work, where I saw a series of these bins out in the hallway, not in the little cubicle, but out in the hallway. What in the world are they doing there? Well, these are clean bins waiting to be exchanged for dirty bins. So what will happen, and this happens all over the country, in your institutions, your universities, your schools, anywhere people might menstruate, right? Anywhere. Is that a truck like this will come to your place, your institution, like this. How often it comes depends on how many people in that institution might require using the bin. So a little bit of surveillance here almost, or counting. How many people do we have who might use this? How many products might they use? How often do we exchange? But say it's once a week, once a fortnight, for example. And these trucks are filled with clean bins. And then a cleaner, will go in with the clean bins, take the dirty bins out. So it's an exchange. Crucially, this is not done, usually, by the normal unionized kind of cleaning staff within your institution. This is outsourced, and it's been so for a long time. And why? Why this elaborate thing for this specific type of waste? We can also talk about a similar story for nappies, but that's not my focus today, but this is outsourced work, which is quite interesting in the waste space, where we already have cleaners. You'll have noticed that I'm using images from PHS, which is the company I'm going to be focusing on today. PHS, Personal Hygiene Services, comes from Britain, and this is a very British story. Britain was one of the kind of pioneers within the sanitary bin and exchange and cleaning system space, and we'll get back to why that might be. If you've traveled, you might have noticed that not all countries have this system of disposing of menstrual waste products. So that would suggest that some countries manage without this system. But in Britain, it's become a norm, a really strong norm. And almost everywhere you go, a public space, there will be these facilities. So buying into this service from, for example, PHS or Rentokil or Canon or one of the big companies, Initial, you get the bin, the plastic bin and the modesty flap, and you get the person driving around exchanging the bins. Take the dirty ones with the content inside, exchange for a clean one. Where does all the waste go? Well, it's bagged up and it's usually burnt. So this is an incineration system, and it's driven to places, a couple of places within Scotland, within England, Wales, where it's taken care of. Recently, there's been a shift in the industry going from burning wet waste to dry waste, which is a little bit better environmentally speaking, apparently. And PHS is also kind of working on a program to generate energy from this burning. But that said, this is still a bit of an environmental issue, right? So part of this story is one of the reasons for the sanitary bin is that we want to stop the environmental issue of flushing these things, but we're still relying on an incineration system. So this is one of the things we'll track. So much so for what is a sanitary bin. You can hopefully see that behind this boring rectangular square is a whole industry. It employs very, very many people. And this company is very, very big, for example. All these companies are very big and influential in Britain because they're in our workspaces, institutions every single week. But what did people do before this ingenious system? Now, the history of menstrual products is not a long history if we're talking about commercial products. Maybe we're talking about 100 years, give or take, depending on where you are in the world, right? But in Britain, pads, for example, single-use pads, which are very different to the pads today, but something that we can call a pad, come on the market in around, as you can see here, 1916, 1920. Tampons a little bit later, first in the US in the 1930s. So we're talking about 100 years of disposable, single-use menstrual products. Before, what did people do? Well, they might make it themselves, use cloth, rely on other methods, washing things themselves to a greater degree. So we've got this kind of sea shift. And after the Second World War, we could talk about a more of a saturated market where most people shift over to using single-use products. So this is a short history. But this is a super early example that I'm showing you. Advertisement from Southalls, another company that is no longer with us, who are advertising towel suspenders, which could be used while you are menstruating. And below, you will see that they're also advertising cremators. I never know how to pronounce this word in English, but incinerators, basically. So at the advent of the single-use disposable menstrual product market, immediately people realize, well, what are we going to do with the waste? Because once you have a single-use product, after you've used it once, it becomes waste. So this kind of dance between these clean, hygienic products that then become soiled and become waste begin even at the start of the industry. But it's much later that we get wholesale use of incinerators, and even then, it's not everywhere. I'm showing you here, again, for some of you, this might be kind of recall memories of being at school. Some of you will not know what this is about. The bunny incinerator was one of many types of incinerators that we used in, for example, public gyms and swimming pools and some schools in Britain. Again, just talking about Britain here, not the wider world. And how would you use this object? I'll get back to the name. You would take your used pad, which most people would be using at the time, out of the public cubicle and into the public space where you wash your hands and you put on your makeup and you have your smoke or whatever. And on the wall would be a little machine, a little incinerator that would sometimes churn up the waste, sometimes with a hand or some sort of mechanized system, and it would burn it. Obvious red flag, fire hazards all around. I've spoken to quite a lot of people who remember these items and tell stories of almost burning down the school, right? It's not a good idea. Obviously, they were used for other things too, like putting out your cigarette stubs. It just wasn't a good idea. They were incredibly unpopular. We know very little about the incinerators. Few people have written down anything about it, but from anecdotal evidence and the little evidence that we do have, we know that they're unpopular because they are smelly and they are loud, and crucially, they are public. So you have to go into that public area where maybe the bullies are standing, and it's a public performance of menstruation, right? Here I am with my object, putting it in this machine. It makes sounds, it makes smells. Of course, that's not going to work in a school environment, right? In any environment. I mean, would you like to do this? Probably not. So the bunny incinerator is a kind of brief flash in the pan, but it also tells us a lot about menstrual culture at the time. What does a bunny have to do with any of this? Why the sweet kind of lagomorph in the middle here? Well, I go down many rabbit holes in this talk and on this project, and one of the rabbit holes is that I actually happen to be the mother of a rabbit. This is Mr. Albus, and he is a rabbit. So just don't get this confused, okay? This is a rabbit. And rabbits have nothing to do with any of this. The reason it's called a bunny incinerator is because the old style of single-use disposable pads, you would wear a belt around your waist, and the kind of fabric or the cellucotton or whatever it might be that stuck out on the side of this, which this bad photograph, apologies, hopefully shows you, the little bit of kind of fabric at the end, some people said that it looked like bunny ears. I don't know if I'm convinced, but we go from that kind of story to a company using that slang term, that code, if you will, that symbol, to call this a bunny incinerator with a bunny on it. Maybe because it's in a school setting, they're trying to make it a bit cute, I don't know, make it child-friendly. But this caused confusion because people would presumably think, you know, what does a bunny have to do with menstruation, right? So all of these codes and the secrecy around talking about menstruation, obviously in a school system too, and maybe education is not that great, caused confusion on top of the kind of technical failures of this object. It just didn't work. And we know also that it didn't work because there was a lot of demonstrations and use to how to use this. So in Norway, we have nurses going around schools, because in Norway they were used a little bit as well, but also in Britain, telling people how to correctly use this. So that some of that documentation shows us that there was a need to show people how to use it. And usually that demonstration went hand in hand with a demonstration of how to use hygienic sanitary products. So again, these two industries are always hand in hand. The production of single-use disposable products and the waste setting. So this isn't working, but we need new ideas. This is a stigmatized taboo topic in the mid-century, and very few people talk about it. One group that kind of went the other direction and did talk about it was the Medical Women's Federation. And the Medical Women's Federation wrote several leaflets about menstrual education and issues and structures in the 1930s, but also in the 1960s. And from there, we can get little glimpses, tiny glimpses of this issue. They illustrated, for example, the incinerator, kind of correct use and bad use. This is correct use, nice ponytail, nice kind of polite, putting the image, putting the product in. And someone had torn out the image of incorrect use. So you can only imagine what people were doing. But from these notes, they have a couple of interesting kind of historical links. One is during wartime, and we know that during wartime women come into different professions. So they wrote, endless trouble was encountered in persuading service women to use the bins and wrapping paper provided, and the storage of soiled towels behind pipes and drawers and down lavatories was one of the real trials of the period. So bins and wrapping papers, what's that about? The Medical Women's Federation noted that incinerators were not working and suggested instead that you put simply a bin in the public space where you wash your hands, where you have your smoke, where you put on your makeup, instead of the incinerator. So simple exchange here. Turn those incinerators off, they're not working. But these bins in the public space, they're also incredibly unpopular, as this quote attests to. So why would people be hiding these things behind pipes, flushing them, or doing this kind of stuff? I would assume that it's because that public performance part is still there, even though the technical issues of the incinerator is gone. But, so these public bins, they're unpopular. The incinerators are unpopular. But it's even worse, they note, and this is kind of, let's zoom out for a minute, when there's nothing. They said it seems inexcusable that 75 of 112 schools that they surveyed have neither bins or other disposable methods like an incinerator. So a lot of people are still left with nothing, where the option is take it out in your bag, if you're lucky enough to have a bag, or flush it down the toilet. What are you going to do? You're going to flush it down the toilet. So there's issues with the technologies, but most of the time there is no solution at all, leaving people at sea with what they're going to do with, the blood on their hands. Another kind of rabbit hole. I love the kind of culture of these bags from the period. These bags that do not work and are also unpopular. We've got our incinerator now. Hopefully we understand what that hints to. But we've also got flowers, and then the wonderful reuse of a candy bag as a menstrual disposal bag. So there is a little bit of culture and fun in here too. But I come to my third question, who came up with the idea? Enter Alfred and George Tack. Alfred and George Tack were brothers, likely twins, businessmen working out of London, and they had founded by the 1950s a great deal of successful businesses, and they were looking kind of to invest in new business ideas. And they're working at the same time that the Medical Women's Federation are worrying about these unpopular technologies. Now, we know that Alfred and George Tack had a secretary who was a woman. I have not been able to find her name. No one seems to remember, but still, footnote, she was there. She's the one who was sifting through business proposal and came across the proposal to get involved in this thing that the Medical Women's Federation had already said was an issue, that employers needed better disposal methods and they needed someone to take care of the cleaning as well. So Alfred and George, from this, come up with an idea whereby they will provide bins and also take care of the waste. But the crucial thing is they're not going to just provide one bin in the public space where you wash your hands and you do your makeup and so on, but in the cubicle. And this really is innovation, and it works. So we know that they followed what the Medical Women's Federation said. Remember, endless trouble. These things are unpopular. It is the public performance part of menstruation that is troubling, not necessarily the technologies or the the bin that was originally there. Alfred and George Tack begin carefully by calling round to businesses that they've already established and that are near them, asking, do you employ women or girls? What do you do with your sanitary waste, your menstrual product waste? Although they would have said feminine hygiene. Well, we tie it up, we throw it out, we don't know what to do. So they uncover a real need and they capitalize on it extremely quickly. And they start word of mouth, over time through salespeople and trades people who sell directly and will visit institutions, universities. By the time we get to the kind of 70s and 80s, it's a snowball effect and it becomes almost totally normalized. If you don't have it, you see it somewhere else, you think my institution should have this. Now, why these two? Why did these two go for this idea? Again, it's a stigmatized, taboo topic. These are two men who are often described as gentlemen, very careful, very kind, but by no ways radically interested in women's health or bodies or menstruation. Well, we know very little about them. They were Jewish immigrants, and we don't know from where. And they wrote a great deal about their experience. And again, they come to Britain in the 50s. And some of their experience makes it into the way that they do business. So Alfred Tack, who did lots of business things, but also wrote about 100 books, wrote 1,000 Ways to Increase Your Sales in 1965. And we get some interesting hints as to what kind of person this is who gets into the game of menstrual business at this time. He said, for example, I've seen salesmen, and this is to the point that he had maybe a different approach to selling and business ethics than his competitors at the time. And he had a specific anti-racist and anti-sexist stance. So he wrote, I've seen salesmen, when selling to a foreign buyer, speaking very, very slowly, articulating each word, while looking at the buyer as if he were a little simple. This, of course, is salesmanship at its worst, and it also shows a complete lack of understanding of human relations and good manners. Whoever you sell to, wherever he may come from, whatever his nationality, you should sell to him in exactly the same way as you sell to anyone else. Lovely mix here of kind of human rights and business, but you get a little bit of a sense of who Alfred is. We know so little about him, so we really have to go through what he writes. In the same book, he writes, the correct way to treat a woman buyer is to sell to her in exactly the same way as you would if you were a man. This is unusual in the business community of 1950s, 60s London, and might have, this is a hypothesis, made them open to the idea of capitalizing on this business idea. What they do is they start a company called Personnel Hygiene Services, which is today the largest provider of these items in Britain, but also beyond Britain. So it's a true success story. But who did the work? Remember that what they were promising is, we are going to provide you with the bin for your cubicle, and then we are going to take it away, and we are going to clean it, and we're going to give you a new bin. So who is going to do the cleaning? Again, we know very, very little. All we have to go on is a couple of images from the competitors of PHS, because PHS did not take any images of their workers. One image from Southalls, the company that's no longer there, reveals a large immigrant community who are doing shift work, very hard work, cleaning these bins manually. That doesn't happen anymore. At some point, they switch over to mechanized cleaning. But still, there's a whole story here to be told about kind of cheap labor and who does this work. Really gritty work, right? Work to do with cleaning out blood and all sorts of waste that other cleaning staff perhaps don't want to touch. We also know a little bit from Canon. Canon is still with us, doing very well. Stanley Osler-Cannon, the founder of this company, and some of the women who did the cleaning work. I think this image is so interesting. Again, lots of unnamed women, right? But look at how they're dressed in the smocks and in the boots, right? This is wet work. You're using kind of high pressure hoses, you're using bactericide, you're using chemicals, and you're using perfume to kind of clean these things quickly. And these businesses like PHS, like Canon, they are huge successes, so it takes off. right? So they're doing more and more and more work. Again, I don't know much about this, but I think this image says so much about who does the work that we maybe don't want to think about. And maybe, you know, there's a bit of a debt to these women too, that they did do this stuff and kind of made the whole experience more private and pleasant for people to use. So, you know, if you like the bin, if you like using it, you know, you could think of these workers. But why does it work? My fifth question. What problems does it solve? Why does it take off? And why are employers saying yes when Alfred and George calls and says, we have this proposal for you? 3 things, and I'll get into some details. It solves the problem of environmental waste and flushing. And flushing in Britain is a huge deal because the pipes are relatively small from kind of Victorian age. So it is a bigger deal here than in some other countries that have pipes fitted later or modernized. Also, at the time, the environmental and the women's environmental networks and movement is growing, and they are talking about the overlap of gender and environment, and specifically about menstrual waste. One example is the book The Sanitary Protection Scandal from 1989, difficult to get a hold of, but fascinating, which points out issues not just to do with this, but also about ingredients in products, how pads and tampons are made, I mean, the whole ecosystem. 2, the problem of hygiene and public health. There is a sense that these products, when used, when they have blood and bodily fluids on them, are dangerous. I'll get back to that. And 3rd, the problem faced by employers as the law changes. So let's look briefly at each of these. Health and hygiene. I've taken this list of kind of what the product solves, what problems the product solves from a current website. So this is kind of moving us into the present day. And they promise they will solve the problem of smell. So here there is an assumption that menstrual products and menstrual blood will smell, which it might do if it comes into contact with oxygen, but with that flap there, highly unlikely. So smell through bactericides and perfumes. Sight, right? You will not see these unsightly things through the modesty flap. Remember in those kind of public bins that they tried to use during the war years, you see what's in the bin, and people do not want to see it. I mean, do you want to see it? We might laugh at some of these taboos, but I think there is some reality in this. Bacteria. Usually that's left very vague. It will just solve the issue of bacteria. What type of bacteria? Usually not stated. HIV, again, fascinating. This whole story obviously does intersect with the history of HIV/AIDS, but there's no evidence that you can contract HIV by touching menstrual products. I've never seen a single example of that. Still, it shows up on these lists. Staphylococcus aureus, which is associated, for some of you perhaps, with a scandal around the Rely tampon in 1980, where Procter & Gamble made a tampon that, long story short, made some people sick and some people did die. Staphylococcus aureus was part of that, but it's a kind of thing that you either have in your body or you don't. You can't contract it by touching in this way. And then usually on the list is E. coli, and you'll have to tell me if this is something that you can contract from blood. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting list. A little bit of myth-making here, perhaps, a little bit of intersection with crisis points in blood history, toxic shock syndrome, HIV, and a little bit of reality, right? Smell and sight. You don't want to see it? We'll take care of that for you. Now, at the time, the law also changes a great deal, making it harder for employers to not care about this. I've got 4 laws from you that underscore kind of how employers are really in a kind of claustrophobic hold by the start of the 2000s. And you have to deal with this. You have to think about it. As late as 1990, the Environmental Protection Act imposed a duty of care on organizations that produced, kept, or disposed of menstrual waste. That's more or less every institution, right? More or less. 1 year later, the Water Industries Act, and see how all these intersections kind of circulate around the issue of menstruation, states no sanitary waste should be flushed away. So then that kind of squeamish kind of norm, that issue, it becomes law. You cannot flush this stuff away. The following year, the Workplace Health, Safety and Welfare Regulation Act recommends that all businesses should ensure that women's toilets, and women's toilets only, which will cause issues down the road, were provided with suitable methods of disposing sanitary waste. So then this kind of norm, it becomes law. And the issues it causes further down the line, as I'm sure you can see, is that men's toilets do not have this, and disabled toilets often do not have this, leaving some people really in the same position as other people were in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now, 2005, finally, the Hazardous Waste Regulation Act states that the responsibility for determining if waste is dangerous rests with the producer of the waste, meaning that public spaces actively opt in to calling menstrual waste a hazard. So this is like, there's lots of laws, regulation, tightening in. You have to care about menstrual waste. You have to dispose of it responsibly. You cannot make a system whereby people flush. And no one can flush this stuff. So you have to think about how you're going to solve that. But there's not a law that says you have to buy into the cleaning and exchange system. That has become a norm. So this is when we get a real interesting, I think, visual culture of signs that really start appearing in kind of the late 80s, 90s, and today. I mean, there is such an interesting variety of these signs that I also collect images of these. And how do you gently talk to people about their menstrual waste without offending them, being clear, for example, about, I mean, how do you do it across languages? Some people use images. That doesn't always work. Some people, like ScotRail, like to use humor, and some people just use passive aggression. One of my favorites were, "Lady, don't flush." Very interesting sign. So again, this is a really strong norm. It's not the law that you have to do this kind of stuff. You have to think about that waste. But all these signs kind of pop up because clearly there are some fault lines in the systems that are used. Now, have there been any critical voices to any of this stuff? Very, very, very few. But I'll point out to you 3 examples. One, Chella Quint, who's a very important, to this day, activist, sign maker, artist, educator, who's been very influential in the kind of menstrual equity space. So you should look her up anyways, her work, period positivity movement, period positive. But what she did a few years ago is that she made little scenes to put into the bags. And the idea was to kind of expose these bags as interesting objects, make you look at them again. So if you were lucky enough to come across one of these, there's not many, you maybe look at the bag and start asking questions like, wait, why is the woman in a corset? Who is this woman? Like, where does she come from? And what is this bag about? And in the scene, she's reproduced the woman, who is so famously often on the PHS type of bags. And she's asking questions about sex education and menstrual rights and advertising and all sorts of things. And I think the point here is to make us look at this object with fresh eyes and think, what really is this bag saying to us? What is this image of this woman saying to us about the correct way to menstruate? Very politely, with your big ground skirt, right? It really kind of emphasizes a certain type of culture. The other criticism, which I've been able to find anyway, comes from the Women's Environmental Network, a loose coalition, but also an actual NGO coming out of Britain in the 1970s, 80s, who criticized the industry. And a typical quote will be, "The immediate problem of disposal for women occurs in public places where there is inadequate or no provisions for disposal. As women, we're faced with the problem of whether to dispose of our used sanitary towels, tampons down the toilet or take them home with us." So she's kind of suggesting here that the problem is still there. If you're caught out in whatever bathroom you're in, you're still on your own, trying to make a decision, do I put this in my bag or in my sock or whatever, or do I flush it? But the thing that I think is wonderful actually about the Women's Environmental Network's work at that time is that they never pointed the finger to the individual and said, you're not doing this right, you're flushing, you're disgusting, you're harming the environment. They always pointed the finger to the industry. And that's what this book is about. This industry produces all these products, but does not think about, the life cycle of their products. One more example from the art world. I said I was an art historian. The artist Judy Chicago in 1972 includes a bin it's not a PHS bin, maybe we can imagine that it is, which is overflowing in this installation of menstrual products. Now these are, and like maybe you can think about how you feel when I say this. These are painted with paint. It's not blood, right? There's a bit of a relief there. I don't know, but I think her point here again was to make an installation in an art gallery, an art space, to make us think about, well, all these products, they promise to solve everything to do with menstruation, taboos and pain, and you can go to the moon and you can cycle and you can ride horseback. But what about the waste? And do they actually solve all of these problems? So those are kind of 3 examples that I've found of a little bit of critical interpretation. And I'd love to hear more examples. I'm sure you've seen things too. Now the future, and I'll just end up here. Where should the bins be placed? I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I do not have the answers. But these are the things that the industry is discussing. Okay, so I've been to some of these kind of meetings for the sanitary bin industry, the conferences and stuff. So they're very interested in where should the bins be placed. Obviously, there is an option for expansion into men's bathrooms. None of the industry has taken the jump yet and said that they want to do that, but they're talking about it. It's a big debate. And what about disabled, what we might call disabled bathrooms, right? Often there's nothing there, and often they're changed much slower, leaving them full or unpleasant to use. So where should the bins be placed is one question. It would be interesting to see if there will be a change. Second, how will new products change the industry? You might have heard that menstrual cups are becoming more popular, and menstrual cups do not produce this type of waste at all. You just collect the blood and you can flush down the toilet, that's fine, it's just liquid, right? So if more people are using that, do we need to change the bins as often? There's an interesting question for employers. Third, what about landfill? That problem is still with us. Every tampon not flushed is a tampon that's burnt goes to landfill or is incinerated. So that issue is kind of never ending as far as I can see without any other solutions. And some might say, is this kind of upholding menstrual etiquette, this like constant concealment, or is it part of equity in the workspace that you don't have to think about, you don't have to be anxious about where you're going to put your product? Maybe a little bit of both. And then finally, should the industry have a role in policy making as it currently does? So the industry is part of the Period Poverty Task Force down in Westminster, for example. And what kind of power role might it hold there? How might it be able to change things for the better? I think focusing a little bit more on these companies might be worth our while. I'm going to end up with this image because that's where everything ends up. As I said, every single week, new bags end up incinerated or on landfills, depending on what company you use. And that's what we can say for this industry. That's where it ends up. There are some attempts at changing the system, showing you some advertising here of people are really trying to make energy from it, create new technologies or whatever. But it doesn't quite solve all of the issues that I've pointed to as to where these things should be and what kind of system it upholds. So I'm going to end here. I've asked lots of questions. I've shared to you what I know. There's lots I don't know, and I'd love to answer any questions that you have, and also maybe hear about what you think about these things and if you've heard anything about the industry. If you want to know more about kind of menstrual history and business history, my book Cash Flow is open access and free, and you can find it online, and it goes through a lot of examples like this from a business perspective. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.